They said my guest house violated community standards and demanded I tear it down. But when I started digging into their records, I uncovered something they never expected. Years of secret backdoor deals, zoning manipulations, and targeted harassment. They tried to destroy my property. I ended up destroying their entire operation. Ryan was finishing his morning coffee when he noticed the envelope sticking out of his mailbox. Thick, crisp, with the HOA's logo stamped across the top. The kind that never brought good news. He opened it without much thought, expecting another generic reminder about trimming hedges or garbage bins. But this time, it was different. According to the notice, the small guest house he'd built 2 years earlier, fully permitted, inspected, and approved by the city, was now considered a violation of community standards. The letter claimed it was an unauthorized secondary dwelling, and the HOA was demanding he demolish it within 30 days or face fines starting at $500 per day. Ryan read the letter 3 times, heart sinking a little more each time. The guest house had been a project he poured himself into. His brother had lost his job during the pandemic, and building a place for him to stay while getting back on his feet wasn't just practical. It was personal. Ryan did everything by the book, applied for city permits, hired licensed contractors, and passed every required inspection. The city had signed off. The structure was legal. So what the hell was the HOA talking about? He walked outside and stared at the guest house at the far end of his yard. It wasn't large. 1 bedroom, a small bathroom, a kitchenette, tucked behind trees, barely visible from the street. It was neat, painted to match his main home, and surrounded by the same kind of manicured landscaping required by the HOA. It blended in perfectly. If anything, it made the property look better. He called the HOA office immediately, but the person who answered said all questions had to go through the compliance officer and that the matter was non-negotiable at this time. When Ryan asked for a copy of the regulation he supposedly violated, the response was vague. "We're just enforcing the CC&Rs. You'll find it under Section 3.2, Subclause B." Ryan hung up and pulled out his binder of HOA documents, a collection he never thought he'd have to seriously use. He found Section 3.2. It mentioned secondary structures needing approval, but also clearly stated that anything permitted by the city must then be reviewed by the HOA only for aesthetic impact, not structural existence. There was no mention of demolition. He began to feel the slow, creeping sensation that this wasn't about rules. It was about something else. Why now, after 2 years of silence? Why this sudden urgency? This aggressive tone? Later that evening, Ryan walked the neighborhood. He noticed something strange. 2 blocks down, another homeowner had a detached garage converted into a studio. No fines, no letters, no drama. Around the corner, one house had a pool house twice the size of his guest unit. Still no signs of HOA interference. He started making a list, snapping pictures discreetly and writing down addresses. Back at home, he placed the violation notice on his desk and looked at it for a long time. Something about it felt off. The language was too specific, too pointed. It felt like more than policy. It felt like a personal strike. And that's when Ryan made the decision. He wasn't just going to prove his guest house was legal. He was going to find out why they were targeting him in the first place, and who was really behind it. By the end of the week, the pressure had escalated. Ryan received a second letter from the HOA, this time marked "Final Warning." The tone was sharper, colder. It stated that if he failed to comply, the HOA would take further action to enforce compliance, including legal escalation and the filing of a lien on his property. The letter was signed not just by the compliance officer, but also by the HOA president herself, Linda Caro. The name struck a chord. He remembered Linda from a few annual meetings, always dressed in muted colors, a tight smile stretched across her face, the kind of person who spoke in rehearsed lines and never took questions without reading from notes. She was the type to treat authority like ownership. Now she was coming after his property. A few days later, Ryan noticed a small group of neighbors gathered by their driveways, whispering as he walked past. It wasn't paranoia. One of them, an older man he barely knew, avoided eye contact entirely. Another, a woman from 2 doors down who once complimented his landscaping, quickly turned away and pretended to check her mailbox. Something had shifted. Then came the flyers. Folded sheets left on doorsteps across the community with the HOA's official header at the top. The text below outlined concerns about unapproved structures damaging community values and warned residents that violations like these could affect property values for everyone. There was no name, no address, but it was obvious who they were referring to. Ryan stared at the flyer, feeling the slow burn of anger settling in his chest. This wasn't just about his guest house anymore. The HOA was actively working to turn the neighborhood against him. The fines, the threats, the isolation, it was a pattern. And he was starting to wonder how many other people had been through this exact routine and given up quietly. So he began knocking on doors. He started with the house 2 blocks down, the one with the detached studio. The homeowner, a quiet man named Derek, opened the door cautiously but relaxed when Ryan explained why he was there. Derek hadn't received a single warning about his structure. He built it 4 years ago, never heard a word from the HOA. No complaints, no fines. When Ryan asked if he had filed for HOA approval, Derek laughed and said he hadn't even thought to. He'd just gotten the city permit and moved on. He even offered to show Ryan the permit and inspection report. That was the second data point. The pool house around the corner? Ryan stopped by there, too. The couple who lived there were in their 60s and admitted that they'd gotten a brief letter from the HOA at the time, but after providing proof of city approval, they'd never heard another word. So why was Ryan the only one facing demands to demolish a legal structure? Back at home, he pulled out the initial approval papers he'd received from the city when the guest house was completed. Everything was in order, stamped, signed, and filed properly. Then he began to compare his situation with the ones he'd just heard about. What he saw was clear. The HOA selectively enforced its rules, and that meant this wasn't just policy enforcement, it was personal. He opened his laptop and created a spreadsheet. Names, addresses, types of structures, whether they'd received violations, and whether they'd ever had any issues with the HOA. The more he filled it in, the more obvious it became. Ryan wasn't in violation of the rules. He was a target, and it was time to find out exactly why. Ryan spent the next week doing what most homeowners would never imagine: filing public records requests, poring through zoning maps, and visiting City Hall during his lunch breaks. He knew that if he wanted to confront the HOA, he couldn't just argue on principle. He needed documents, patterns, and cold, indisputable evidence. He started with the building permits for his guest house. The file at the city office was complete: stamped approvals, inspection sign-offs, final occupancy certificate. Everything had been done by the book. But while talking with the clerk, something strange came up. When Ryan asked if the HOA had ever contacted the city regarding his structure, the clerk frowned and typed on her keyboard. According to the system, the HOA had submitted a letter of complaint 3 months earlier, anonymously signed as community representative. The letter claimed that Ryan's guest house was built in defiance of HOA guidelines and was believed to be unpermitted. The city had followed up with a request for more information, but none was provided. Still, this internal complaint had been enough to alert city records and might have contributed to the HOA's sudden aggression. Back home, Ryan cross-checked this timeline with the HOA's internal newsletter archives, which were posted online. In the same month of the anonymous complaint, the HOA board had voted to approve a special landscaping contract with a company called Urban Visions Property Group. That name stuck out. He had seen one of their trucks parked outside HOA President Linda Caro's house just 2 weeks ago. the same week her entire backyard was redone. Curious, Ryan dug into the company. What he found was disturbing. Urban Visions wasn't just any landscaping company. It was registered under the name of Linda's nephew. A further search showed the company had been paid by the HOA 8 times in the last year for various projects labeled aesthetic improvements and community enhancement. All of the invoices were under $5,000, the legal threshold in the HOA charter that allowed spending without requiring approval from residents. He began collecting copies of every payment record available online, and in doing so, stumbled across something even more damning. One of the community improvements listed 6 months ago had been a compliance inspection audit carried out by an unnamed contractor. Ryan had never heard of such an audit taking place, and none of the neighbors he spoke with could recall it either. There had been no notices, no entry permissions, no summary reports delivered. It was as if the project was entirely fabricated. Now the picture was forming. The HOA had created a paper trail of selective enforcement, one that gave them room to target anyone they wanted, while funneling money into the pockets of their own connections. The guest house violation? It was just a convenient excuse, something easy to latch onto, flashy enough to justify fines, and vague enough to confuse. Ryan printed every record, highlighted connections, and pinned a timeline on the wall of his office. Names, dates, payment logs, complaints, board meeting minutes. It was all there. But he needed to be strategic. Blowing the whistle too early would give the board time to cover their tracks. So instead, he took his next step carefully. He contacted a local investigative journalist, someone known for covering municipal corruption and neighborhood power abuse. He sent the journalist everything he had, asking only for confidentiality until the facts could be verified. Then he called his lawyer. What had started as a strange violation notice was quickly becoming something far larger. Ryan was no longer just defending a structure in his backyard. He was preparing to expose an entire system built on favoritism, hidden deals, and manufactured threats. Ryan's case was no longer a quiet neighborhood dispute. What began as a personal fight had morphed into a calculated investigation, and now the dominoes were beginning to fall. The journalist he had contacted responded faster than expected. After a single phone call and a review of the documents Ryan sent, she was on board. Her name was Talia Bennett, and her reputation for digging into community-level corruption had made her both respected and feared in local government circles. She didn't waste time. Within 3 days, a headline appeared on the website of the city's most read local paper. HOA president accused of targeted harassment and secret financial ties to contractor relatives. The article laid it all out. The shady payments to Urban Visions Property Group, the fake compliance audit, the anonymous complaint sent to the city, and the selective enforcement against Ryan, despite his full legal compliance. The guest house was mentioned prominently. It became the symbol of a broader problem, an HOA leadership more interested in protecting its own power and pocketbooks than enforcing rules fairly. The article spread like wildfire in the community. Ryan started receiving text messages from neighbors who had previously kept their distance. Some apologized for believing the HOA's narrative. Others shared their own experiences, minor violations that turned into major threats, arbitrary fees, ignored requests for maintenance in common areas while HOA leaders spent community funds on beautification projects that always seemed to involve the same few contractors. People were angry. That weekend, residents called a special meeting, a right they had under the HOA bylaws if more than 25% of the homeowners requested it. Over 60 people showed up, more than twice the quorum required. The atmosphere was tense but focused. Copies of the article were being passed around. A few residents came with spreadsheets and personal logs of fines and notices they'd received over the years. What once had been isolated frustrations now merged into a collective realization. Linda Caro didn't attend the meeting. In her place, a visibly nervous board member named Alan tried to downplay the situation. He read from a short statement saying the HOA categorically denied any misuse of funds, and that any complaints should be handled through proper legal channels. But the crowd wasn't buying it. People demanded answers. They demanded resignations. By the end of the night, a petition had begun circulating to recall the current board and hold new elections. Ryan didn't lead the effort. He didn't need to. The neighborhood had already taken that step on its own. Meanwhile, the journalist's follow-up story revealed that Urban Visions had received over $40,000 in contracts from the HOA in the past year alone. Most of that work had been cosmetic: flower beds near the clubhouse, gravel replacement at the walking path, seasonal enhancements at the entrance. Yet nearly all those projects had been assigned without bidding, and often under the $5,000 cap, skirting transparency requirements. The city council also took notice. While municipalities typically don't interfere in HOA affairs, the financial irregularities, combined with the attempted misuse of city zoning channels, particularly the false complaint, triggered a formal inquiry. Now it wasn't just a neighborhood scandal. It was a legal liability. Ryan's lawyer filed a cease and desist letter against the HOA's threats, followed by an intent to sue for damages if any further retaliation occurred. With mounting pressure from all sides, legal, journalistic, and public, the board went silent. For the first time since receiving that violation notice, Ryan felt the momentum shift entirely. The same HOA that had tried to intimidate him into submission was now retreating, exposed and fractured, and he wasn't finished yet. The final unraveling of the HOA came faster than anyone expected. Within 10 days of the emergency meeting, the community formally held a recall vote. The process, usually slow and burdened with procedural roadblocks, moved with unprecedented urgency. Years of silent frustration had been compressed into a single moment of clarity, and now the residents weren't just upset. They were mobilized. Of the 5 board members, 4 were voted out. The 5th, Alan, the same man who had read the hollow statement in Linda Caro's absence, resigned before the vote even concluded. His letter cited health reasons, though everyone suspected it had more to do with public pressure than personal well-being. The following week, a new interim board was elected. Unlike the previous regime, it was made up of longtime residents with no connection to contractors or financial ties to vendors. Their first act was to issue a public statement to all homeowners. We acknowledge the missteps, the lack of transparency, and the unfair enforcement practices that have taken place under the previous administration. We are reviewing all financial records, all fines issued over the past 3 years, and all existing disputes. Effective immediately, all enforcement actions related to the alleged unauthorized guest house on Mr. Ryan Mitchell's property are voided. It was the vindication Ryan had fought for, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been strong-armed into silence. His guest house, the supposed violation, remained exactly where it was, intact, legal, and now completely above challenge. But the consequences for the old board didn't end with removal. The city's formal investigation concluded within a month. It confirmed that multiple contracts had been awarded without transparency, that vendor relationships had not been disclosed, and that at least 2 members, including Linda Caro, had personally benefited from HOA-funded projects through their relatives' businesses. The city stopped short of filing criminal charges, but imposed financial penalties and ordered a complete restructuring of the HOA's procurement process. Linda, meanwhile, vanished from the neighborhood entirely. Her house was put up for sale quietly, and within a few weeks, it sat empty. Ryan never publicly gloated. He didn't have to. His neighbors did it for him. At the next community gathering, the first one under the new board, he was greeted with handshakes, nods, even applause. Someone brought cupcakes with little paper guest houses stuck in the frosting. It was light-hearted, but the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. His quiet act of resistance had sparked a movement. More importantly, the HOA was no longer feared. Residents began coming forward with proposals to allow solar panels, to ease restrictions on backyard landscaping, to create a transparent review board for future disputes. The days of arbitrary decisions and power plays were over. The community, for the first time in years, felt like it actually belonged to the people living in it. For Ryan, it wasn't about revenge or power. It was about principle. He had built something meaningful on his property, not just a guest house, but a space that symbolized independence and family, something no rule book had the right to take from him. They tried to crush him with policies, fines, and shame, but in the end, he didn't just keep his guest house. He took down the system that tried to destroy it.